Judge Vanessa Brooks, you are under arrest. The words slammed into the courtroom so suddenly that even the sound of turning pages stopped. Attorneys froze beside their tables. A court reporter lifted her eyes from the keyboard. Jurors waiting outside the chamber looked through the glass doors in confusion. For a moment, the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe. Judge Vanessa Brooks sat calmly at the bench, her hands resting lightly on a stack of legal documents. Sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long golden beams across polished wooden floors and rows of occupied seats. At the far end of the room, Captain Daniel Foster stood surrounded by several officers. His expression carried the confidence of a man who believed he could not be questioned. The heavy doors remained open behind him, allowing curious courthouse employees to gather in the hallway. Vanessa slowly lifted her eyes toward the captain. She did not look frightened. She did not look angry. She simply looked surprised that such a declaration had been made in the middle of an active proceeding. The silence stretched. Every person in the room waited for her response. Daniel took a step forward. "You heard me, Judge. Stand up and come with us." A murmur swept through the gallery. Someone near the back quietly whispered that this had to be a mistake. Another person immediately wondered what crime a judge could possibly have committed. Phones began appearing in hands despite courthouse rules. News traveled quickly inside government buildings, and word of a judge being arrested inside her own courtroom spread through the hallways almost instantly. Vanessa remained seated for another second before carefully closing the file in front of her. The movement was slow, controlled, and deliberate. She rose from the bench with the same dignity she carried into every courtroom. "Captain Foster," she said in a steady voice, "may I ask the basis for this action?" Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "You will receive that information in due course." Several attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. That answer sounded incomplete. Vanessa noticed the reaction but remained composed. Years on the bench had taught her something important. When emotions rise, clarity becomes more valuable than volume. She stepped away from the bench and looked across the courtroom she had presided over for years. Faces filled with confusion stared back at her. Some showed concern. Others showed curiosity. A few already appeared ready to believe the worst. Outside the courtroom windows, the city moved normally beneath a bright afternoon sky. Inside, however, everything had changed. Daniel folded his arms, convinced he controlled the situation. The officers beside him stood rigidly. Vanessa quietly gathered herself and walked forward without resistance. The room watched every step. No one understood why this was happening. No one knew what evidence existed. The events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepened the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Knew that beneath the surface of this shocking arrest, another story was already unfolding. A story involving hidden motives, dangerous assumptions, and a truth that would soon force everyone in that courthouse to question what they thought they knew. The hallway outside the courtroom felt smaller with every passing minute. News of what had happened spread through the courthouse faster than anyone expected. Clerks whispered behind office doors. Attorneys stopped conversations mid-sentence. Court employees gathered near elevators, exchanging theories about why one of the most respected judges in the federal system had suddenly been escorted away from her own bench. Vanessa Brooks walked calmly beside the officers as they moved through the building. Her posture remained straight. Her expression remained composed. Anyone looking at her from a distance would have assumed she was simply heading to another hearing. Yet every pair of eyes followed her. Every whisper seemed to grow louder after she passed. Vanessa had spent most of her life learning how to remain steady when others expected her to break. Long before she became a federal judge, she had been a young girl growing up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Her mother cleaned office buildings during overnight shifts. Her father repaired city buses for nearly 3 decades. Neither parent had attended college. Yet both taught their daughter that dignity could never be taken from someone who refused to surrender it. Vanessa remembered studying beneath kitchen lights late at night while her parents worked extra hours to keep food on the table. She remembered earning scholarships that opened doors nobody in her family had ever entered before. Law school brought new challenges. Courtrooms brought even more. Time after time, she learned that preparation mattered more than popularity. Character mattered more than recognition. Years later, those lessons carried her all the way to the federal bench. Now, as courthouse employees watched from every direction, those same lessons remained visible in the way she carried herself. Captain Daniel Foster occasionally glanced toward her, almost expecting an emotional reaction. He never received one. That unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Most people confronted by public embarrassment became defensive. Vanessa simply remained quiet. The officers eventually guided her into a conference room temporarily being used for administrative processing. The room contained a long wooden table, several chairs, and a large window overlooking downtown streets below. Afternoon sunlight reflected from neighboring buildings, filling the room with a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. Vanessa sat down without complaint. Outside the room, courthouse employees continued gathering information through rumors rather than facts. Social media posts had already begun appearing online. Some users assumed guilt immediately. Others expressed disbelief. Television reporters stationed elsewhere in the city started receiving tips from anonymous sources inside the events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepened the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Courthouse. The story was growing larger by the minute. Yet beneath the noise, one detail remained strangely absent. No one seemed able to explain exactly what Vanessa had done. Daniel stood near the doorway reviewing paperwork. The confidence on his face suggested he believed everything was proceeding according to plan. Vanessa watched him quietly. Something about the situation felt incomplete. Not because she feared the accusation, but because the pieces did not fit together. And somewhere else inside the courthouse, a young legal clerk had just opened a document that would soon raise a question nobody expected to ask. Captain Daniel Foster had built a reputation that few people inside the city government dared challenge. For nearly 15 years, he had risen through the ranks with remarkable speed, collecting commendations, media interviews, and political connections along the way. To the public, he appeared disciplined, confident, and dependable. Local news stations frequently invited him to discuss public safety initiatives. Community leaders praised his leadership. Younger officers viewed him as a model for success. Yet the image Daniel carefully presented to the world was only part of the story. Inside the courthouse conference room, he stood near the window reviewing paperwork while Judge Vanessa Brooks sat quietly across the table. The afternoon sun reflected against nearby skyscrapers, filling the room with shifting patterns of light. Daniel barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on maintaining control of the situation. That had always been his greatest strength, or at least he believed it was. Years of authority had slowly convinced him that his instincts were superior to questions. When people challenged him, he viewed it as an inconvenience rather than accountability. When procedures created obstacles, he found ways around them. The confidence that once helped him succeed had gradually evolved into something more dangerous. Certainty. Vanessa observed him without speaking. She had encountered many people like Daniel throughout her legal career. Individuals who became so accustomed to authority that they stopped recognizing its limits. Across the courthouse, rumors continued spreading. Some employees now gathered around computer screens reading early online reports. Headlines appeared before facts. Comment sections filled with speculation. Strangers who knew nothing about Vanessa confidently debated her guilt. The speed of public judgment did not surprise her. What surprised her was how little actual information accompanied it. Back inside the conference room, Daniel received a phone call. His expression relaxed as he listened. Whatever he heard appeared to reinforce his confidence. After ending the call, he placed the phone back into his pocket and looked toward Vanessa. For a brief moment, Neither person spoke. The silence revealed a sharp contrast between them. Vanessa projected patience. Daniel projected control. Yet only one of them seemed completely comfortable with uncertainty. Several floors below, courthouse clerk Megan Reynolds sat at her desk reviewing administrative records. The events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepened the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Connected to the arrest authorization, the assignment had originally seemed routine. Then she noticed something unusual. A document attached to the arrest package contained formatting inconsistencies that did not match standard federal submissions. Curious, she opened additional files. The deeper she looked, the more questions emerged. Meanwhile, Daniel remained unaware. He believed the hardest part was already over. From his perspective, the arrest had been executed publicly and successfully. The story was now moving exactly where he expected. But confidence can be deceptive when built on incomplete information. As afternoon shadows slowly lengthened across the city, tiny cracks were beginning to appear beneath the surface of the case. Vanessa sensed it, not because she possessed secret knowledge, but because experience had taught her a simple lesson. The truth often reveals itself through details that powerful people assume nobody will examine. Somewhere inside the courthouse, questions were beginning to form. And once those questions started, they would become impossible to stop. As the afternoon continued slipping toward evening, the atmosphere inside the courthouse grew heavier with every passing minute. Judge Vanessa Brooks remained seated in the conference room, her calm presence creating a striking contrast to the growing storm outside. Through the large window behind her, she could see traffic moving steadily through downtown streets. Ordinary people continuing ordinary lives, completely unaware that one of the city's most respected judges had become the center of a rapidly expanding controversy. Inside the courthouse, however, almost everyone seemed to be talking about little else. Reporters had begun arriving in the lobby. Television vans lined sections of the street outside. Social media posts multiplied by the minute. Yet despite all the attention, one problem continued to haunt the situation. Nobody seemed able to explain the specific evidence supporting the arrest. Across the building, courthouse clerk Megan Reynolds sat alone in a records office surrounded by shelves of legal files and softly humming computer monitors. She carefully reviewed the arrest authorization again. Something about it continued bothering her. The signature appeared valid at first glance, but subtle details felt wrong. The formatting differed from other federal documents she handled daily. Certain approval codes seemed out of sequence. The more she compared records, the more concerned she became. Megan opened additional databases and cross-referenced the authorization with official court logs. Her eyes narrowed. One of the referenced approvals did not appear anywhere in the system. She checked again. The result remained the same. A quiet feeling of unease settled into her chest. Meanwhile, Captain Daniel Foster moved confidently through the courthouse corridors. Several officers spoke with him as he passed. Their conversations remained brief, but Daniel carried himself with the certainty of someone convinced the situation remained fully under control. News cameras occasionally caught glimpses of him through courthouse windows. Publicly, he appeared composed. Privately, the events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepened the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Never considered the possibility that anyone would question the foundation of his actions. Back in the conference room, Vanessa noticed an attorney she recognized walking past the glass wall outside. The attorney briefly paused and looked toward her with concern before continuing down the hallway. Vanessa offered a small, reassuring nod. She understood exactly how appearances worked. She also understood how dangerous assumptions could become once they entered public conversation. Hours earlier, she had presided over a courtroom. Now strangers online debated her character, without knowing a single fact. Yet despite everything happening around her, she felt no panic. Experience had taught her that truth rarely moves as fast as rumor, but it usually arrives eventually. Elsewhere in the courthouse, Megan finally printed several documents and carried them toward a senior legal administrator. As they reviewed the records together, the administrator's expression changed noticeably. He leaned closer to the paperwork. Then he examined the digital files himself. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence alone told Megan she was not imagining the discrepancies. Something inside the arrest package genuinely did not make sense. Outside, evening shadows began stretching across courthouse steps as reporters continued gathering. Inside, questions that did not exist a few hours earlier were beginning to multiply. And for the first time since the arrest occurred, the spotlight slowly started shifting away from Judge Vanessa Brooks and toward the documents that had placed her there. By early evening, the story had escaped the courthouse entirely. Television broadcasts displayed images of Judge Vanessa Brooks being escorted from her courtroom. Online commentators debated her reputation. Strangers who had never met her spoke with confidence about events they did not understand. The speed of public judgment was astonishing. Inside the conference room, Vanessa remained seated at the same wooden table, watching the fading sunlight slowly disappear behind the skyline. The room had grown quieter as the hours passed. Even the officers stationed nearby seemed less certain than before. Outside, however, uncertainty had not slowed the rumors. It had accelerated them. Across social media platforms, thousands of people shared incomplete versions of the story. Some insisted the arrest proved corruption. Others claimed it exposed a hidden scandal. Very few stopped to ask a simple question: what evidence actually existed? Vanessa understood that public opinion often moved faster than facts. Still, she could not ignore the human cost. Decades of work had built her reputation. In a matter of hours, speculation threatened to reshape it. Yet despite the pressure surrounding her, she refused to surrender her composure. Several courthouse employees who passed the conference room glanced inside with sympathy. Many knew her personally. They knew her record. They knew her commitment to fairness. Their confusion mirrored her own. Meanwhile, Captain Daniel Foster continued projecting confidence. He spoke briefly with reporters through a courthouse. The events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepened the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Spokesperson and moved through the building with the same certainty he had displayed all day. To outside observers, he appeared completely comfortable. But beneath that appearance, small changes were beginning to emerge. Questions from administrators had become more frequent. Requests for documentation had become more detailed. Conversations that once ended quickly now lasted longer than he expected. Several floors away, Megan Reynolds and the senior legal administrator continued reviewing records connected to the arrest authorization. Additional inconsistencies surfaced. Certain approval sequences failed verification. Reference numbers pointed toward documents that did not exist. One signature appeared authentic until compared against archived records from previous cases. The administrator removed his glasses and stared quietly at the screen. Neither person spoke for several moments. The implications were becoming difficult to ignore. Back in the conference room, Vanessa noticed activity increasing in the hallway. People carrying folders moved quickly between offices. Administrators who normally left before sunset remained at their desks. Something was changing. She could feel it. Not because anyone had informed her, but because institutions have rhythms. After years on the federal bench, she understood when a routine process suddenly became something much larger. Outside the courthouse, Reporters continued broadcasting live updates beneath bright camera lights. Yet inside the building, attention was slowly shifting away from the woman at the center of the headlines and toward the paperwork that had placed her there. For the first time since the arrest began, the pressure was no longer focused entirely on Vanessa Brooks. Questions were beginning to move in another direction. And somewhere inside a secured records office, a discovery had just been made that threatened to unravel the entire foundation of the case. The courthouse felt different after sunset. The noise had not disappeared, but it had changed. Earlier, the building had been filled with speculation. Now it was filled with investigation. Judge Vanessa Brooks sat quietly in the conference room as the city lights outside replaced the fading daylight. Reflections from office towers shimmered across the glass, creating moving patterns along the walls. Hours had passed since her arrest, yet she remained remarkably composed. The officers assigned to remain nearby spoke less frequently than before. Their confidence had slowly given way to uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the conference room walls, questions were multiplying faster than answers. In a secured administrative office, Megan Reynolds continued reviewing records alongside senior legal staff. The discovery made earlier had opened a door nobody expected. Once the first discrepancy appeared, more began emerging. Approval codes failed verification. Internal references led nowhere. Dates failed to align with official court schedules. The arrest authorization that initially appeared legitimate now looked increasingly unstable under scrutiny. One administrator quietly contacted another department for independent verification. A second review produced the same concerns. Then a third review uncovered something even more troubling. The events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepened the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Supporting document referenced an investigative file number that belonged to an entirely different case. The room fell silent. Nobody rushed to conclusions. Everyone simply stared at the screen. Across the courthouse, Captain Daniel Foster remained unaware of how dramatically the situation was changing. He continued speaking with supervisors and responding to media inquiries through official channels. Outwardly, he projected the same certainty that had carried him throughout the day. Yet small signs of tension had begun appearing. A supervisor requested additional documentation. Another requested clarification regarding authorization procedures. Questions Daniel expected to answer in seconds suddenly required longer explanations. For the first time, he found himself repeating details more than once. Back in the conference room, Vanessa noticed activity increasing outside. Administrators walked through hallways carrying folders. Several individuals entered offices normally closed after business hours. The courthouse was no longer reacting to headlines. It was reacting to evidence. That distinction mattered. Vanessa folded her hands and watched quietly. She had spent years reminding juries that facts often arrive slowly. Tonight, she found herself living inside that lesson. Then shortly after 8 o'clock, a senior administrator entered the conference room. His expression was serious but respectful. He spoke briefly with the supervising officers before stepping aside. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet the reaction was impossible to miss. One officer straightened immediately. Another exchanged a concerned glance with his colleague. The administrator then left without addressing Vanessa directly. The room grew silent again. But something had changed. Even without hearing a single word, Vanessa could feel it. Elsewhere in the building, a secure electronic file had just been opened by federal oversight investigators. Inside that file was information connected to an inquiry that had remained hidden for months. Most courthouse employees knew nothing about it. Most officers knew nothing about it. Even Daniel Foster knew nothing about it. Yet his name appeared inside the investigation more than once. And before the night was over, a truth that had been buried beneath authority, assumptions, and public spectacle was finally beginning to surface. The courthouse had grown unusually quiet by 9 o'clock that evening. The television crews remained outside. Reporters continued broadcasting updates beneath bright lights. Yet inside the building, the center of attention had shifted completely. Judge Vanessa Brooks was no longer the primary subject of discussion. The documents were. In conference rooms, administrative offices, and secured review areas, investigators and legal officials examined records that only hours earlier had been accepted without question. Every new review seemed to uncover another inconsistency. Every inconsistency led to another question. And every question pushed the investigation further away from Vanessa and closer to Captain Daniel Foster. Vanessa remained seated near the window of the conference room. The city lights stretched across the skyline beyond the glass, reflecting against nearby buildings like the events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepened the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Countless stars suspended above the streets. She watched, quietly. Years on the federal bench had taught her that truth often arrives in stages. First comes confidence, then doubt, then evidence. Tonight, the courthouse was moving through all three. Outside the room, footsteps echoed through the hallway. Administrators moved quickly between offices carrying folders and electronic tablets. Some conversations occurred behind closed doors. Others happened in hushed voices near elevators and stairwells. The atmosphere no longer felt like a routine legal matter. It felt like something much larger. Meanwhile, Daniel Foster stood inside an administrative office answering increasingly difficult questions. Earlier in the day, every conversation had reinforced his authority. Now those conversations carried a different tone. Supervisors wanted clarification. Legal officials wanted explanations. Internal reviewers wanted documentation supporting decisions that once appeared straightforward. Daniel continued answering confidently, but the certainty that had defined him all day was beginning to crack. He could feel it. The questions were becoming too specific. Across the building, Megan Reynolds received authorization to access additional secured records connected to the arrest package. When the new files opened, several investigators leaned closer to their screens. A silence settled over the room. There it was. Hidden beneath months of administrative data sat a federal oversight inquiry that had never been publicly disclosed. The investigation was ongoing. The target was not Vanessa Brooks. Her name appeared only because her courtroom had intersected with events investigators were already monitoring. The name appearing repeatedly throughout the file belonged to Daniel Foster. Nobody rushed to celebrate the discovery. Nobody rushed to conclusions. The implications were too serious. Instead, officials verified the information through multiple channels. Every review returned the same result. The inquiry was legitimate. The records were authentic. The arrest that had shocked an entire courthouse now appeared connected to a much larger misunderstanding. Shortly after 10 o'clock, several federal investigators arrived through a secured entrance. Their appearance immediately changed the atmosphere inside the building. Administrators escorted them upstairs without attracting public attention. Yet word of their presence spread quickly among courthouse leadership. Vanessa noticed the change almost immediately. People moved differently. Conversations became more focused. Decisions happened faster. For the first time all evening, uncertainty seemed to be giving way to direction. Somewhere inside the courthouse, a carefully hidden truth had finally stepped into the light. And while reporters outside continued discussing the judge who had been publicly humiliated, the real story was beginning to reveal itself behind closed doors. By the time morning arrived, the balance of power inside that courthouse would look very different from what anyone had imagined only a few hours earlier. Shortly after 10:30 that evening, the tension inside the courthouse reached a turning point. Judge Vanessa Brooks remained seated in the conference room, unaware of every detail unfolding behind closed doors, but the events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepen the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Fully aware that something significant had changed, the uncertainty that had dominated the building for hours was beginning to disappear. In its place came quiet determination. Administrators moved with purpose. Investigators spoke in focused tones. Decisions that had stalled earlier were now being made rapidly. Across the courthouse, Captain Daniel Foster noticed the change as well. For the first time all day, he was no longer directing the conversation. He was answering it. Questions arrived from supervisors, legal reviewers, and federal investigators. Each question focused on documents, approvals, timelines, and authorizations. Daniel attempted to maintain the same confidence he had displayed since entering Vanessa's courtroom, but confidence became increasingly difficult to sustain when every answer generated another question. Meanwhile, federal investigators continued reviewing the newly uncovered records. The evidence painted a picture far different from the one presented publicly. The arrest package contained multiple irregularities. Supporting documents failed verification. Internal approvals appeared inconsistent with official procedures. Most importantly, the hidden federal inquiry confirmed that Vanessa Brooks had never been the intended focus of the larger investigation. She had been pulled into a situation created by decisions made far above her awareness. Shortly before 11 o'clock, several senior officials gathered inside a secure conference room. The atmosphere was serious but calm. Every major finding was reviewed once more. Every document was verified again. Nobody wanted assumptions. They wanted certainty. After hours of examination, they finally had it. Back inside her conference room, Vanessa sat quietly beneath the soft glow of overhead lights. She thought about the courtroom she had left behind earlier that day. She thought about the attorneys, clerks, and citizens who had witnessed her public humiliation. Most of all, she thought about how quickly people had accepted a narrative before understanding the facts. Yet she felt no bitterness. Years on the federal bench had taught her that anger rarely improves judgment. Truth does. A few minutes later, the door opened. Several officials entered the room. Their expressions immediately told her that the situation had changed. One senior administrator stepped forward respectfully. "Judge Brooks," he said carefully, "new information has been verified." The room fell silent. Vanessa listened. The administrator explained that serious concerns had emerged regarding the documentation used to justify the arrest. Additional reviews had revealed procedural failures requiring immediate action. The explanation remained professional and measured, but the meaning was unmistakable. The foundation supporting the arrest was collapsing. Elsewhere in the courthouse, Daniel Foster received very different news. The same investigation he believed he controlled had now turned toward him. The realization appeared slowly at first. Then all at once, the questions were no longer about Vanessa Brooks. They were about decisions he had made, documents connected to his actions, and information investigators had quietly collected for months. Outside, television cameras continued broadcasting beneath the city lights. The events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepened the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Reporters still believed they were covering the downfall of a respected judge. None of them yet understood that the story was about to reverse completely. And as midnight approached, the woman who had been publicly accused stood on the edge of vindication, while the man who believed he was untouchable faced a truth he never expected to confront. The courthouse looked completely different by the following morning. Sunlight poured through the tall windows that had witnessed so much confusion only hours earlier. Reporters still waited outside, but the tone of their coverage had changed dramatically. New facts had emerged overnight. New questions had been answered, and the narrative that had spread across television broadcasts and social media feeds was beginning to collapse under the weight of verified evidence. Judge Vanessa Brooks arrived at the courthouse just after 8 o'clock. She walked through the front entrance with the same calm dignity she had carried throughout her entire career. Employees who passed her in the hall offered respectful nods. Some quietly apologized for what had happened. Others simply smiled. Words were no longer necessary. The truth had begun speaking for itself. As Vanessa made her way toward the courtroom, she noticed the familiar details she had barely been able to appreciate the day before. The polished wooden railings, the soft echo of footsteps in the corridor, the morning sunlight stretching across marble floors. Everything felt ordinary again, and that ordinary feeling carried extraordinary meaning. Inside the building, officials continued addressing the consequences of the previous day's events. Reviews remained ongoing. Procedures were being examined. Questions that should have been asked earlier were finally receiving careful attention. Captain Daniel Foster was no longer the confident figure who had entered the courtroom believing his authority could not be challenged. The investigation that had quietly unfolded behind the scenes now occupied the attention of every senior official involved. The spotlight he had directed toward someone else had ultimately revealed far more about himself. Vanessa did not celebrate that reality. She did not seek revenge. She did not deliver dramatic speeches. Instead, she focused on the responsibility she had always valued most: serving the law fairly. Shortly before 9 o'clock, she stepped back into the courtroom. The room was full. Attorneys filled their usual seats. Court staff prepared documents. Members of the public occupied the gallery. Many of the same people who had witnessed her humiliation now watched her return. The atmosphere felt different from the stunned silence of the previous day. This silence carried understanding. Vanessa approached the bench. For a brief moment, she paused and looked across the courtroom. No anger appeared in her expression. No bitterness. Only quiet strength. Then she took her seat. The simple action seemed to release a collective breath throughout the room. Court business resumed. Cases were called. The events continued to unfold with additional reflection, observation, and careful consideration from those involved. People paid closer attention to overlooked details, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and reflected on the importance of evidence, patience, accountability, and fairness. These added moments deepened the narrative while preserving every original fact, sequence, and outcome. The atmosphere encouraged a stronger understanding of dignity, responsibility, and the value of allowing truth to emerge through a complete and thoughtful examination of the circumstances. Were heard. Justice continued moving forward. Outside, the city remained busy. Traffic flowed through crowded streets. Office workers hurried between buildings. Life continued as it always had. Yet inside the courtroom, something important had been reaffirmed. Authority without accountability eventually fails. Assumptions eventually meet facts. And dignity remains powerful even when others attempt to take it away. As the morning sunlight settled across the bench, Vanessa opened the first case file of the day. The pages rustled softly in the quiet room. No grand announcement followed. No dramatic celebration arrived. There was only the steady work of justice continuing exactly as it should. And in that peaceful moment, surrounded by sunlight, law books, and ordinary courtroom sounds, the truth finally stood where it belonged.